Electric Wire podcast. My name is Kristin Gilkes. I am your host for this podcast, and I am the Executive Director of the Customers First Coalition. I'd like to say a special thank you to the members of the Customers First Coalition for sponsoring this podcast series. The members are the Citizens Utility Board of Wisconsin, Dairyland Power Cooperative, the IBEW 2150, Madison Gas and Electric, the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, Renew Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Electric Cooperative Association, and WPPI Energy. We've got a great podcast lineup for you today. First, I'm joined by Marge Anderson, an Executive Vice President at Slipstream, for our first interview, and then we'll both interview Kathy Kuntz of the Dane County Office of Energy and Climate Change. So we're going to start out with Marge. Marge, welcome.
Thanks, Kristin. I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
We're excited to have you here on the podcast, Marge, and also you're joining me as a co-moderator for 3 webinars that Customers First is hosting with Slipstream in October.
Yes.
We'll take some time later in this podcast to talk about the webinars, but first, Marge, can you tell us more about Slipstream and your role there?
Sure. Slipstream is a nonprofit organization, and we have a long history in energy efficiency. We create, test, deliver, and scale the next generation of energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. And we do that in a bunch of different ways. We have a big research group that goes out and figures out the next set of solutions around saving energy and now integrating all these new energy solutions on a more dynamic grid. And then we have a programs delivery group that figures out how to bring that kind of innovation into utility and government energy efficiency programs. And we also have a strong tradition around education. So we often are training and educating the practitioners who are installing energy efficiency measures and technologies primarily into buildings. And we want to make sure those folks are empowered. So that's what's up at Slipstream right now.
When we were thinking of doing this focus on buildings, Marge, I looked up your bio and I saw that you are the past chair of the U.S. Green Buildings Council. You're on the board of directors for the New Buildings Institute. You're on the board for the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. You were the building working group leader for the Dane County Climate Action Plan. You're really the perfect person to be interviewing on this topic. So Marge, given that background, I want to know your thoughts about the role of buildings and reducing carbon.
Sure. I'm really optimistic about the future of buildings. After working with incredibly smart engineers for most of my career, I don't think there's a problem that they can't solve. I think a lot of the technologies that we need to decarbonize our building stock, which is responsible for 40% of our emissions, are already here. I think the trick is scale. So how do we make every home an efficient home? How do we ramp up to scale in commercial buildings so that every place that people work is an exemplary place to work? And I know that we're going to be talking about our webinar series a little bit in the future. One of the tricks that is going to be really important for scale is to make sure that we are bringing everybody along with us. Right now, there is a big inequity in the kind of places where underserved members of communities live and work. They don't work in the same kind of building stock that that people who have more privilege live in. And there's a big opportunity for us to address equity and get the carbon and the health impacts that we want as well.
That's a great segue into talking about our Equity and Clean Energy webinar on October 6th. When we were thinking of doing a webinar on this building focus, we were thinking absolutely the topic needs to be addressed, but when we think of buildings and low-income housing, renters, we also really needed to address equity issues when talking about buildings, energy efficiency, and clean energy.
Yeah, I've got a couple sound bites that I have found quite shocking from our research that give us a moment to think about equity and buildings. So we did a couple of years ago, Slipstream did a pretty significant study in our neighboring state of Minnesota in manufactured housing, which you'd think of as trailers, people who live, the housing stock that's in trailer parks, and about half of it is in trailer parks, and the other half are trailers that are just not organized into parks. Well, over 50% of the people who live in those homes are low income, according to federal standards. And yet, the average cost to power a trailer for a year is $2,000. And if you think about your power bill, you don't probably pay $2,000 a year for energy in your home, but we're asking the poorest people in the country to take on a burden of $2,000. That's a big stressor. And beyond that, the home is also pretty uncomfortable. It's not very healthy. So we've been successful in implementing a couple of programs, one in Michigan and one in Chicagoland area, to bring those homes up to a much better quality of life standard that is also a much more reasonable energy burden for that family. So that's just an example of how the built environment and equity come together.
That takes us to the topic for our final webinar, Energy Winners and Losers. We're going to talk about some politics and policy in this webinar. Marge, do you have thoughts on policies we could start putting into place to address equity and building issues?
Yes. I think that'll be well teed up even in the first webinar with Tony Reams from Michigan, because he's got some great research he's done on affordable housing. Affordable housing policy is absolutely critical in terms of a political lever that needs to be pulled. When you think about housing has been proven to be intrinsically connected to better health outcomes, to economic mobility, to people's employment prospects, and to greater opportunities for people exiting the criminal justice system. But there's a massive shortage of affordable housing in this country, not just what we build with public subsidies, but even when we think about this COVID epidemic, we had so many people losing their jobs and applying for rental assistance so that they wouldn't be evicted. That's a major public health crisis. And it's an energy opportunity. It's an opportunity to reduce people's energy burdens. That's the thing I think about the most when I think about policy. I think one of the other levers that we need to push is helping policymakers understand how to measure decarbonization in utility programs. And we've seen some successful examples on the East and West Coast of the regulation that guides utilities really integrating decarbonization into utility efficiency programs. I think that could be a cool opportunity for Wisconsin to provide some leadership as well. So I hope we do that soon.
That is a cool opportunity. So I wanted to also sneak in some logistics for our webinars for those of you listening and considering whether or not to register for these webinars. The first webinar we're hosting is on October 6, 2020. It is titled Equity and Clean Energy. It begins at 11 a.m. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers. We have Chairperson of the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin, Rebecca Vach. We have Wisconsin's 45th Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes providing featured remarks. And we've got a panel that will consist of Laura Goldberg from the NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council, and Tony Reams, who is an assistant professor of energy justice at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. The next webinar, the second webinar in the series, is on October 14th at 11 a.m. It's called Building Towards Zero Carbon with Grid Flexibility. We are going to talk about grid interactive efficient buildings, which I guess is referred to as GEBs now.
Yeah, that's what the engineers call them. I'll do some translation for the civilians in the audience.
Thank you.
These are really now that your building could be a battery, now that your building could be a power plant, now that your building could be a gas station, but with a different kind of fuel that charges up your vehicle. and they're producing energy, they have new kinds of demands on them. How do those buildings end up being a better citizen on a grid that is changing really fast too? So we're adding a lot more renewables to the grid at the utility scale, and we're adding new uses and new power generation opportunities at the building scale, at home and at work. How do those two integrate together? And those are the gnarly technical problems that the engineers are working on. So it's a really interesting look at what's the future there, so our buildings are good grid citizens.
So excited for this one. The speakers will be Tyler Huebner, who is the newest commissioner at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. We have a panel consisting of Scott Hackle, who works on research and innovation at Slipstream. We have Phil Markham, who is the Smart Buildings R&D manager at Southern Company. And we have Rose Langer, who is the senior research engineer for the National Renewable Energy Lab.
Yep, I think that'll be a nice peek under the hood at what the next generation of technology leaders are thinking about.
The third webinar, Energy Winners and Losers, will be on October 21st, 2020 at 11 a.m. We have Ellen Nowak, a commissioner at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. We have Denise Bodie of Michael Best Strategies. Denise was the former head of AWEA, the American Wind Energy Association. We have Jessica Pacheco, who has just started Horizon Strategies. Jessica has a background in the investor-owned utility world. And we have Craig Gilbert, who is the Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, joining for this webinar. We just had the first debate this week. I think these issues are going to be on people's mind.
Definitely.
As we get closer, it'll be interesting to hear what people are saying. Marge, other thoughts on what you're hoping to get out of the webinars, or more to say on green buildings?
Well, I just think here in Wisconsin, we've already been a national leader in the green building movement. One of the first chapters of the U.S. Green Building Council was here in Wisconsin, and it was formed before the national organization was formed. Those folks are largely still out there practicing, doing the hard work every day of designing and building green and operating green buildings. You know, Wisconsin was the first place where there was a LEED Platinum version 4 school, and that was in Lake Mills, Wisconsin, in a community where most of the students qualified for free hot lunch. And now we know Kathy's going to talk a little bit about this brand new net zero school in Oregon, right here in Dane County. These are the success stories that get lost sometimes in the political conversations, and they're the labors of love of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of talented professionals. And I think Wisconsin has a lot more going for it than we often talk about, and it'll be really nice to highlight some of those leadership opportunities, whether they're at a utility or in a program or in the field where buildings are getting built and inhabited.
Marge, thank you again for joining. I'm so excited to be hosting the webinar series with you, and everyone can go register for the webinars at customersfirst.org/events.
Kristin, it's a privilege. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Now we will turn you over to our interview with Kathy Kuntz. We're joined now by Kathy Kuntz, who is the acting director of the Dane County Office on Energy and Climate Change. Kathy, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Kristin, it's great to be with you and Marge today.
Tell us about your role, Kathy. How long have you been there, and what have you been up to?
Yeah, sure. So I've been at Dane County's Office of Energy and Climate Change since November of 2019. Our office isn't much older than that. County Executive Joe Parisi created the Dane County Office of Energy and Climate Change in 2017. And really, Joe created the office because Dane County had done a lot to address efficiency and clean energy in its own operations. But by 2017, he was feeling like the county needed to do more at the community level, because we weren't at that point seeing a lot of progress from state or federal officials on climate change. So he created the office and a parallel climate council with the aim that we would create a county-wide, economy-wide climate action plan.
Where are you at on the climate plan, and what's the current status?
Yeah, so the climate action plan was issued in April of this year. Really, that was a close to 3-year effort where folks like Marge, subject matter experts, helped us create recommendations relative to the various ways Dane County as a whole produces emissions. So Marge led our buildings work group. We had work groups on renewable energy and on agriculture issues and on transportation and land use. You know, there were all these different entities making recommendations that went to the council and then ultimately were revised or negotiated and ended up in the climate action plan. There are more than 100 recommendations in the plan, and the plan, if you look at the cumulative impacts of those recommendations, we have the potential to cut all of the emissions produced in Dane County in half by 2030 if we implement the plan. So it's a pretty amazing and ambitious document. For folks who aren't aware, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that we need to reduce emissions at least 43% by 2030 to be on track with a 1.5 degrees Celsius climate future. So it feels good to know we've got a plan to get there. The other thing I would say about what's in the plan is, from the beginning, the county exec was really clear that he wanted folks to focus on what he called the art of the possible. So in Wisconsin, county governments have relatively limited authority. We can't tomorrow mandate a bunch of changes. So he really wanted folks to figure out what we could do within our authority to get there. So this plan is ambitious, but it's also really pragmatic. And so my role, my bliss, is, for anyone who knows me, is really implementation, figuring out how to get things done. So since joining the office, most of my work has been really focused on, well, okay, how do we move these recommendations from recommendations to action? Maybe a good example of that is one of the recommendations from Marge's work group was to recognize entities in our community who were leading, businesses who had buildings that were particularly energy efficient. And we just launched what we're calling now the Climate Champions Program, which is a recognition program to recognize entities that have efficient buildings. The thing we've done in launching that is we actually broadened it. So we're also going to recognize entities that have electric vehicles in their fleets, who've done things around water or other issues, to really make it as broad and expansive as we can. But that's the kind of stuff we're working on right now.
Are there any leaders you've recognized already?
Well, so the entity I always like to call out is the Oregon School District just completed construction of Forest Edge Elementary, and that's the first net zero energy school in Wisconsin. So that's a school that's heated and cooled with a ground source heat pump. It has a significant solar array on its rooftop, some battery storage, and being net zero energy means that facility is projected to produce as much electricity as it will use on an annual basis. It's doing its own thing, and I think that's the first net zero energy school in the state. It's pretty exciting that that's here in Dane County, and really helping us think about what's possible in this realm.
Really cool. Someone sent that to me. We'll put a link in the show notes. And what are some of the other items you've talked about in this buildings working group?
I can jump in there if you like. I really want to reinforce what Kathy is saying about the art of the possible, and I think that was a great way for Joe Parisi to go, because Wisconsin is one of the early mover states in terms of green buildings. We have an enormous amount of talent and projects that are already in the ground here in the state. We were early leaders, and we routinely, our builders are building way above code. And so when you think about recognizing these climate champions, there are a lot of people doing this right now. The trick now is to scale it, to really amp this up and show people that it's really quite possible. One of the other things that we looked at, one of the big issues that came up on the buildings working group that the whole team was pretty passionate about was understanding your energy use in the first place. And so this Climate Champions program will allow there to be sharing of all the good news about energy use in the buildings that volunteer to do that. And it will also, hopefully will inspire some other folks who've been thinking about this to think about measuring and sharing their own energy and other resources use, so they can see how they're stacking up and how they can improve and what are the bottom line opportunities to thrive. Now, you know, we're entering a time with COVID where things are really strange in the commercial building environment, and businesses need every advantage that they can get right now. And there's just tons of wasted energy out there that can help them create better spaces for people and drive more profit.
I couldn't agree more with that. It is, and really, the more, you know, part of our aim with the Climate Champions is when we call out leaders, other people ask their teams, well, aren't we a leader too? And it gets people to start looking at that data and going, how do we become a leader? I want, you know, everybody across the county competing to get one of our cool window decals that they're a Dane County climate leader. I would like them in every storefront in the county.
So Kathy, when you look at the future of buildings, what role will energy efficiency and beneficial electrification play?
It's a great question. It's a huge question. I mean, when I think about buildings, we're at this really important moment to start being serious about coupling efficiency and electrification. And, you know, we're starting to see that a little bit. The Oregon school is a good example of they made that school as efficient as possible because then they needed less solar to power that school. You know, it's all interrelated. I think we have in the next 5 years a really substantial hurdle to get over in terms of electrification. In Wisconsin, for as you know, I've been involved in efficiency since the mid 1990s, and we've always told people it's better to heat buildings and water with gas than with electricity. It's more efficient because we were talking about electric resistance heat at that point. You know, we're talking about next generation cold climate heat pumps now, which are a whole different thing. But we're going to have to re-educate the public and our contractors about what the most optimal technologies are. And that's not going to be fast. I mean, we need some, Marge talked about our history of market leadership. We're going to need to work with some of those market leaders to start installing those technologies so that they become mainstream 10 years from now. You know, it's not going to happen overnight. This is a long struggle, but the faster we start, the more likely we can hit those goals we've got around this.
Yeah, I think there's a big opportunity to communicate the non-energy benefits around electrification. So here's a great example where many of us are remote now. We're working at home, our windows are open, and we're on an important conference call, and our neighbors both decide to mow their lawn at the same time. I'm looking forward to both of my neighbors getting electric lawnmowers because I'll be able to do a conference call. But those are the kind of simple things. I think about electric vehicles in my home, and I think about never having to pump gas again, and having more storage space, and being able to leave a kid in the car with a car running and know that they're safe. Those are the kind of benefits. And when we think about the technologies that get installed in our homes or our offices, we'll be more comfortable. There'll be more productive spaces. There's huge opportunities once people actually start having these experiences with these technologies.
Yeah, I want to just reiterate that, and particularly the safety piece of that, because the thing we've normalized is we've normalized burning fossil fuels inside our well-constructed tight homes. And for decades now, the Wisconsin home building industry has really been pioneers on figuring out how to make us safe in a really tight, efficient home where we're burning stuff inside it. You know, the what kind of ventilation has to happen. But life gets a lot simpler if that heat is provided by electricity and we're not burning combustion fuels inside our living space. I mean, there's just there are, I think, as consumers start to see some of those safety benefits, there's going to be a lot more interest in these technologies, because really, as a regular person, you care that your house is warm. You are not emotionally attached to the fuel behind that, but knowing that it is safe and warm is more beneficial, you know. And so there's some important transitions, and we need to figure out how to talk about all of that to folks.
If I wanted to build a home someday, which we would love to, what new technologies would we be putting into our home?
So I definitely think looking at all electric options are important. You know, whenever I hear that question, I think immediately about what's the long term here. You know, you're dreaming about building a home, Kristin. You're probably not dreaming about building a home that falls down 10 years after you build it. You know, you want to, yeah, that wouldn't be good. You want a home that's going to be around for 50 years. So you want to be thinking about, where is this all going? And it's clear, you know, that we should be building homes that are heated and cooled with electric technologies, that they should, if they don't already integrate renewable energy, they should be solar ready, so you could add panels later if you wanted to. You know, it's that sort of embracing that the things that maybe only 10% of the population has now, 90% of the population will have in 25 years, and you want your home to be able to do those things, kind of thing. I think so. I tend to think more about those things. You know, there's a lot of talk about home automation and how much that might come into this. And I think, you know, I've spent a lot of my career thinking about human behavior. I'm not yet persuaded that all of the automation is going to appeal to people. You know, it's a lot of, can I flip the switch, or do I need to program something on my phone so I don't have to flip the switch? You know, I'm a switch flipper. It just seems like, or we could sit in the half dark, because that's okay too, and we're not using the lights at our house actually. So, you know, Marge, you might have more thoughts on automation, especially in commercial buildings.
Yeah, I think starting with the home, I really think the commercials that I've seen are all about safety and security. I can see who's coming to my door, and oh, that thing integrates with my thermostat. And people really want that feeling of safety and security. I think there's also a big opportunity to communicate to people, whether it's a commercial building or where they live, and sometimes those are the same thing right now. We're discovering is, you know, buildings are 40% of the emissions. When people think about climate and climate change, they think about smokestacks and industry and cars on the road, and stuff coming out of a tailpipe. They don't think about their homes and their offices. What if we started to show the big connection between humans and nature and a brighter, more optimistic future where the environment is healthy and protected? What if we were stressing that instead of that I can turn up my thermostat or turn down my thermostat while I'm still driving my car home? I think there's a fundamental connection with the world that we live in that we're not tapping into enough. And it's become profoundly emotional. I think a lot of us have seen as we've been working from home, and nature is our only respite. So I think I work with a lot of engineers every day. They are brilliant. They are going to solve all the problems. And I'm not kidding. That you can't throw a challenge at an engineer that they can't solve. But we are big primates. And the way we communicate with people about these solutions is to show them all the values and things that we've been caring about since our species developed.
This is putting both of you on the spot. If there's one thing everyone could do to make their home more energy efficient and reduce their contribution to emissions, what would it be?
Oh boy. Who's going first, Kathy? Rock, paper, scissors.
Nope, I can go because I think it's about looking at your usage and how your usage compares. In much of Wisconsin, you can pretty easily at your utilities website get some information about how your household usage compares to similar homes. I mean, I think that a piece of this is really looking at, well, what are we doing? I can tell you that my house is in sort of the bottom quartile. We use way less electricity than all of our neighbors. And that's because I'm a little bit manic about why would things be plugged in that nobody's using kind of thing. And really we can, but my usage is about a third the typical household's usage. So that tells me that most of the people listening probably have at least 15% that they could shave off their usage just by, is there an old TV in the guest room that nobody's turned on in a year and a half? Turn off the smart switch to it, or or unplug it until guests arrive. You might, there's just all of these opportunities around that, the inefficient cable boxes. There's just, I could go on forever, Kristin. Marge, jump in.
I'll give you an alternative view from a lazy person's perspective, because I'm that person. I'm a hassle avoider consumer. My people in my family say I'm allergic to handles. I don't do stuff. And despite working for 26 years in energy efficiency. So I can tell you the order that the lazy, hassle-free person has tackled in our house. Insulation and air sealing, number one opportunity still in Wisconsin. And man, the benefits that we've seen in our 1962 home in terms of soundproofing and no moisture problems inside the house and not dripping windows. And it's invasive and it's irritating when you're getting it done, but it makes a huge difference. And then Kathy talked a little bit about the plug loads. More and more with gaming and smart TVs and all of these different systems that we have that we're using with our devices that aren't equipment, there's big opportunities there. And then my aspirational third thing is my next car is going to be an electric vehicle because it's cleaner, it's quieter. I'm lazy. I don't want to go to the gas pump. It's gross and it's usually raining. So
Especially now.
Yeah, so I'm going to charge up my car at home. That'll be my next purchase when my hybrid dies.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you sharing your insights with our listeners.
Thanks, Kristin. It was great to join you.
Thank you again to both Marge and Kathy for joining me today. A reminder to sign up for the webinars that we talked about on this podcast. You can go to customersfirst.org and find registration information under events. Thank you again to the members of the Customers First Coalition and to Slipstream for your partnership on these webinars. Remember to follow our podcast on Twitter @TheElectricWire. And with that, we've actually completed our Energy Innovation Series. We started this series in February of 2020. We took a break for COVID, and I've really enjoyed starting to podcast again. These last few episodes have been great, and we've really increased our listenership. So thank you to everyone who has tuned in. And you'll all have to join the webinar series to see if there's any more announcements about the continuation of the electric wire coming up. Thanks for listening.